Hi everybody, welcome. Getting started a little late due to splitting up the rooms. Thanks for your patience. This is the session on habitat conservation banking, our first session here at the 2013 Texas Land Conservation Conference. Appreciate everybody for coming and for your interest. We've got a great panel of speakers today. We've got folks who are from the banking community. We've got people who work for federal and state agencies, as well as two representatives from Texas Land Trusts who are involved in conservation banking. I'll refer to this as habitat conservation banking to differentiate it from stream and wetland mitigation banking, which folks are also learning about. I know I'm still pretty wet behind the ears on both topics, but this is very different from stream and wetland mitigation banking in some ways, and it's similar in others. There is a separate session happening on stream and wetland mitigation banking if you're interested. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panel of speakers today. The first presentation will be by Kathy Boydston and Charlotte Kucera. Kathy Boydston is the Program Supervisor in Wildlife Habitat Assessment with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. She's worked for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for 27 years. She supervises a staff of 9 biologists, responds to development projects across the state, and is also responsible for maintaining the Texas Natural Diversity Database. Ms. Boydston has extensive experience in working with industry of all types. She works on a daily basis with other state and federal agencies on resource issues and has developed policy and implemented change at the state and federal level. Her focus in the last 5 years has been on wind energy and other related energy issues, such as transmission, and on actions to mitigate the impacts from those developments, such as habitat conservation plans and conservation banks. She's worked on several habitat conservation plans and assisted the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in reviewing conservation banks in Texas. She's partnered with the Conservation Fund and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to bring the first state-level conservation banking training to Texas. She was a member of the Wind Turbine Guidelines Federal Advisory Committee and represents Texas in the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on Energy Issues. She's received her Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Management from Oklahoma State University. And also joining Kathy in the first presentation will be Charlotte Kucera. Charlotte's a Texas Conservation Banking Coordinator and a fish and wildlife biologist for the Austin Field Office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Prior to her employment with the service, she worked for the National Marine Fisheries Science Service and the Texas Department of Transportation, where she worked with the both species conservation and wetland mitigation banks. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Notre Dame and a master's degree in marine science from the University of Texas. From the banking community, we have Jesse McLean and Alan McReynolds. Jesse is a general manager of Bandera Corridor Conservation Bank. It's a collaborative of landowners and private conservation investors in Bandera and Real counties focused on protecting nesting habitat for the golden cheek warbler and black-capped vireo. He has 10 years of conservation planning and environmental consulting experience in the Central Texas area. And Alan McReynolds is the president and managing member of Mitigation Strategies, LLC. Mr. McReynolds is a former member of the Clinton administration's team of environmental advisors. He brings 20 years of real estate experience to Mitigation Strategies, LLC. During his 5-year tenure as a special assistant in the Office of the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Interior, he worked extensively in the creation of mitigation banks for degraded wetlands and endangered species. Mr. McReynolds' pivotal role in creating mitigation banks in Southern California at Bolsa Chica and Rancho San Diego is well known. Mr. McReynolds also earned an MBA at the University of North Texas and a BBA at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a member of the Sierra Club, Galveston Bay Foundation, Gulf Coast Restoration Network, and Native Prairies Association of Texas. He also supports the Houston Grand Opera and is a member of its Board of Trustees. And from the Land Trust community, we have Dan Snodgrass and Mark Steinbach. Dan is the Associate Director of Land Conservation for the Nature Conservancy. He's a wildlife biologist who works to enhance and protect habitat for plants, wildlife, water resources, and people in Texas. Dan has a degree in range and wildlife management from Texas Tech University and specializes in wildlife management, land management, prescribed fire, and conservation easements. He spent 20 years working in conservation, 15 of those with the Nature Conservancy of Texas, and he's worked in conservation throughout the state of Texas. Currently, he's the Associate Director of Land Conservation for the Nature Conservancy, and he oversees the desert, grassland, forest, and fire programs. And also we'll have Mark Steinbach. He's the Executive Director for the Texas Land Conservancy. Mark is a native of Texas and joined the Texas Land Conservancy staff in 2007. He previously worked at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, where he was a private lands wildlife biologist, providing technical assistance to landowners in the Hill Country. Mark's land management experience also stems from his academic career and working on his family's farm in Washington County. He earned his bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries science and master's in rangeland ecology and management, both from A&M. His master's research focused on Texas landowners and their knowledge of conservation policy and land management techniques. Mark received his PhD from the University of Montana in Missoula, from the College of Forestry and Conservation. His dissertation and postdoctoral work focused on land fragmentation in the Rocky Mountain region. So that's our panel of speakers. My name is Frank Davis. I don't know if I introduced myself. I work with Hill Country Conservancy. I'm also a board member of the Texas Land Trust Council. So on behalf of the Texas Land Trust Council, again, thank you for coming. We'll go ahead and get to our first speakers.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. As you can see, we have a great panel here for you today, representing all of the diversified interests in conservation banking. I'm Charlotte Kucera with Fish and Wildlife Service, and I serve, among many other duties, as the Texas Conservation Banking Coordinator. This presentation is really just to kind of get everybody in the room on the same page and give a background on the basics of conservation banking. I'm going to split the presentation up with Kathy Boydston, so you can hear both from the federal agency and the state agency our perspective on conservation banking and the roles that we play as we look at prospective conservation bank properties and how they're credited and debited. Let's see. Okay, so briefly, the history of conservation banking. Really, the first banking of any type was wetland and stream banking. It started about 30 years ago, 1984 being the first wetland mitigation bank being approved. And then we go to the first conservation bank being approved in California approximately about 20 years ago. And then the first conservation bank in Texas was in 2002. That's the Hickory Pass Conservation Bank. It's in Burnett County, Travis and Burnett counties, right over the county line. And so the point here is that banking is wetland banking is about 30 years old, conservation banking about 20 years old, but conservation banking in Texas is only about 10 years old. The amount of banks approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service, this slide is a little bit old, but I was unable to find an update. There are approximately about 120. They can serve more than 100,000 acres and protect more than 60 listed species. There are currently 6 approved conservation banks here in Texas. 5 of them are for listed bird species. 1 is for the Houston toad. And the amount of conservation banks approved by the service since 2010 is 4. So we had 2 prior to that. So in the last 2 to 3 years, the interest in conservation banking has improved at least 3-fold. Oh, good. It shows up better on the big projector than it does on my computer screen. This is the national map for amount of conservation banks approved. It comes directly off the Fish and Wildlife Service's national website. And Texas and Florida are second only to California in the number of conservation banks that are approved in the country. Florida has well over 30 conservation banks. Texas and Florida between 4 and 29, and several other states 1 to 3. The other point to make about this map is that there are a lot of states where we have no conservation banks for listed species. And so familiarity with this idea of conservation banking it differs as you go across the country. So what is a conservation bank? This is the definition that we use, and I'm not going to read it to you, but I would point out a few things. That the values that we're looking at in a conservation bank are conserved and managed in perpetuity for species, and that we would consider conservation banks to provide an in-kind off-site compensatory offset. In other words, we're trying to trade like for like. And if you break down that definition further, you can learn some things that about what's required for a conservation bank agreement. When we talk about a site that contains one or multiple species in their habitat, the way that that's documented to the agency is through a baseline resource inventory or species surveys. The site must be preserved. For us, that's a permanent conservation easement. The site must be managed. There has to be a management plan that addresses the needs and hopefully reduces the threats to those species on the property. In perpetuity means a funded long-term endowment, non-wasting, to support those management and monitoring actions that must be hand in hand with that property. And then the last part of the definition that gets back to this idea of in-kind and off-site compensatory offsets. So bank sites are given credits that may be exchanged for debits that occur through project impacts. We use a ledger to track those credits and debits. And overall, our hope is that banking results in a net species conservation benefit. And if we're talking about a federally listed species, we're trying to contribute towards the recovery of that species and ultimately being able to get it off of the endangered species list. So the currency of conservation banking are credits and debits. Credits being the accrual or attainment of habitat functions or value at a habitat offset site. That would be the banking site, and the debit would be the loss then of those same habitat functions or values at the impact site or the project site. And when we trade them back and forth, that's referred to as either trades or sales or exchanges. So all of these things are authorized under the Endangered Species Act. Either Section 7A2, which talks about the obligation of federal agencies to consult whenever they're going to take listed species, or 10A1B, which is the habitat conservation planning section, which applies to non-federal partners. The incidental take is really where we get the amount of debit. So that's that loss of value that we were talking about at an impact site. The amount of mitigation that's required or the offset is always stipulated in the permit or the biological opinion. And whether the conservation bank whether a conservation bank may be utilized to offset the impact is also stipulated either in the permit or the biological opinion. So not all impacts may be mitigated at bank sites. It depends on what the particular impact is to the species and whether that can be replaced at the bank site. So Parks and Wildlife also has a number of sections of their code that speak to resource protection for non-game species, endangered species. They have a role for habitat conservation plans. They do not have a specific role for conservation banks, but because they have all of these other roles, the Fish and Wildlife Service in Texas feels it's only normal and natural as our partner to coordinate conservation banks with them and resource protection with them. When you look at generating credits, those species credits are generated through conservation actions. They can occur prior to listing if we're talking about candidate or non-listed species. For listed species, we hope that they contribute to downlisting or delisting recovery for listed species. And really the last bullet here is important. What we're trying to do is reduce those threats and provide protection for species. Visually, this is what it looks like. You have an impact site that incurs debits through a permitting process with the service. They are able to offset those debits with credits that are accrued in the bank site. There's a exchange or a sale that goes on. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is on both sides of this equation in terms of approving the permitting action and also approving the amount of credits that are available for the bank. This is a short summary of the bank review and approval process. The review occurs here in the state at the local field office level. Fish and Wildlife Service and Parks and Wildlife review the draft banking agreement documents and speak with the banker and the land trusts about what goes into those bank agreements, management plans, endowment, and also the conservation easement. We can involve other agencies as needed, EPA, Corps of Engineers, NRCS, National Marine Fisheries, etc. We do have to have a complete package for review because ultimately what happens after we review it here at the local level is it goes up to the Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Office, which is in Albuquerque, where it undergoes regional office review and solicitor review and comment. So there's an iterative process here. And most importantly, the approval of conservation banks right now for the services Southwest region resides in the regional office in New Mexico. That is, these agreements are not signed by the local office. They are signed up at the regional office level. Again, as we said, Parks and Wildlife's code doesn't speak to regulatory authority to review conservation banks, but as you know, they are the state resource agency with regulatory authority over state and federally listed species, as well as permitting actions at the state level. The Fish and Wildlife Service relies on them and their district biologists and species specialists to provide us with information specific to locations where impacts may occur, because they're going to have the knowledge at the local level. And when we ask them to review documents, they compile their comments and provide them to us. We take that very seriously, and they will be transmitted with our comments along to the banker and their consultants. Bank guidance and templates. This is the slide I like to call how to make this process go much easier and much quicker. We are working and have drafted regional banking program guidance and templates for conservation banks. They will facilitate the bank approval process. So, like I said, a lot of it is iterative, going back and forth, looking at what's in these particular agreements and what the language says. Our solicitor, of course, also reviews that. So once we have standard language for some of these things, this will go much more quickly. They have been drafted. They are up at the regional office being reviewed right now. And some of the species for which we're working on specific program guidance: golden cheek warbler, black-capped vireo, American burying beetle in Oklahoma, and the lesser prairie chicken. I was asked to provide a brief update on some upcoming listing decisions. Thankfully, we have recently posted a nationwide list of upcoming listing decisions. It is the Fish and Wildlife Service's listing work plan for fiscal year 13 through 18. It can be found at this address on the National Fish and Wildlife Service webpage. And it is searchable. That is, they have posted an Excel spreadsheet that you can actually search by state. So when I did that, I came up with approximately 21 species with upcoming listing decisions here in Texas. These are the decisions that are required because of court-approved settlements. So some of you are familiar with the multi-district litigation and some other court settlements. They ended up with a work plan during which the service committed to review and make listing decisions on a number of candidate species. And so this work plan is the outcome of those listing decisions, and it is posted and it will be updated. So if you have an interest in that, you can find it on the Fish and Wildlife Service webpage. And this is what it all looks like from the service's perspective, is that what we're all trying to reach is recovery for these listed species and get them off the list. Through the Section 7 process for federal agencies, conservation banks would be off-site minimization measures that might be appropriate. Through the non-federal Section 10 side, they would be considered off-site mitigation measures. They could also be potentially on-site mitigation measures if you had a large enough project site where they could do some preservation and restoration on-site that met the needs of those species. And ultimately, again, what we want to do is count all of these credits in conservation banks towards recovery of the species. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Okay. After you saw that last slide, Charlotte and I were probably thinking they're going to be asking, why would you want to go through the conservation banking process rather than use just individual site-specific opportunities? Well, for one thing, the main thing is that when you have a lot of unplanned development completed around these preserved areas, those things are fragmented, they're small, and where most rare species are concerned, they're genetically and ecologically separate, and they usually tend to fail over time. Now, and as we all know with experience, that these large unfragmented tracts usually have a better chance of surviving ecologically and retaining their ecological functions and values, as well as providing better opportunity for genetic exchange among populations and individuals of those species that you're trying to conserve. Banks are generally a lot better at avoiding these smaller areas, what we call indefensible avoidance areas. They're better at aiding in the recovery of listed species because sometimes these recovery goals can be quite high when you're trying to bring these species back to where they need to be. They contribute to existing habitat conservation plans and other strategies. They streamline the permit process for everybody, although sometimes when you hear about it, you think that might not be the case, but I assure you it is. They also provide a lot better assurances. In the form of real estate, there's a perpetual conservation easement that's required with each conservation bank. They also require a long-term management and maintenance plan with adaptive management strategies so that things come up that you aren't anticipating with the species or the weather or habitat issues, wildfires, things like that. And they also have financial assurances associated with them so that those long-term activities, management and maintenance and operation activities, are funded through the life of the project through this endowment. This slide's borrowed from the Wetland and Stream Mitigation, a handbook for land trusts, and if you don't have it, it's a really good resource that you might want to pick up. This talks about the wetland mitigation banking process in detail, the 404 process, which is the process itself is pretty comparable to developing a conservation bank. With the first phase, you have site selection, where you pick up the site, you're going through and developing all the agreements, the conservation easement, the long-term management plan, setting up the endowment. The second phase, after all those documents are completed and signed, is the credit release phase, where the monitoring kicks in and that first set of management actions are implemented. And then on the third phase, the long-term stewardship phase, is exactly what it says. That's where the long-term management kicks in, that you're going to be providing and operating that conservation bank in perpetuity. All of these things are affected, all phases are affected by the agreements that are developed in the site selection phase. So what's done in that first phase affects the credit release and affects the long-term management of the bank. And so for that instance, that's why we recommend that land trusts become involved in all phases. Now they can become involved in just one phase or all phases, but we strongly recommend that if you're getting involved in this, you get involved in it from the start, so you know exactly what your obligations are going to be for this kind of agreement. The land trust can be asked to perform several different roles, as I just said. You can be asked to be the easement holder. If you're going to be the easement holder, you need to realize that this would have an enforcement part to go along with it, of which the Fish and Wildlife Service is not a party to the actual easement, but they do have third-party enforcement rights. If you're the easement holder, you need to be aware of any other, what the actions, the prohibited uses are. Are they going to allow hunting? Are they not going to allow hunting? Are other recreational activities going to be allowed on this property that could affect the conservation values of what you're trying to achieve? Are there other existing structures and existing easements on there? Has this been a homestead for the family that they're now turning into a conservation bank and putting an easement on? That could have some effect, as well as other existing easements like utility easements or road easements. And you need to be aware if there's plans to subdivide the property, such as if the landowner wants to carve out parcels for homesteads for his children at some point in time. Your other roles, you might be asked to be a land manager and implement the management plan. And in that case, you definitely would want to be involved in the development of the plan so that you know what your reporting requirements, what your personnel requirements are, what your financial obligations are when you're going to implement that management plan. You also might have asked to be, again, to be the endowment manager, where you would hold the endowment and manage it so that it would generate enough funds where the land manager is going to be able to implement those long-term maintenance and operation activities that are going to need to take place. When you're in this process, you need to expect to be asked by Fish and Wildlife Service and Parks and Wildlife about your organization, about what are your qualifications. How many people do you have working for you? What are their experience? And what's your experience in managing a conservation bank? Have you ever done that before? Have you ever managed a piece of property for conservation purpose? And whether you're an accredited land trust, or are you in the process of being accredited? And have you adopted the National Land Trust Alliance's standards and practices? Because that's what we would like to see become the standard for conservation banks that are operating in Texas. You also would need to have open conversations with your banker. Who's going to be signing the agreements? Because it's not the same with every bank. Different people sign different agreements in all the different banks that we've worked on in Texas. Who's going to be your point of contact on these documents and in the different agencies? You need to know what kind of reports you're obligated to provide. And you need to know when the easement is going to be negotiated with the landowner so that you can be party to that, to know that if the easement is going to be in line with what your mission is as a land trust. You know, none of us want conservation banks to fail, so communication is the key. You need to identify early what role you're going to assume, what your responsibilities are, what your reporting requirements are, so that you're going to be aware of the personnel and the financial obligations that you're going to have to fulfill these agreements over the life of the bank. And Charlotte and I are available. You need to contact us or any other agencies. There needs to be lines of open communication at all times, although if you call me, I'm probably going to punt to Charlotte. There is guidance out there from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They've developed some standards for mitigation banks that are really good guidance. We recommend you download this and have it as a reference, especially if you've never done this before. I mean, I still look at it. My initial notebook that I took on the conservation banking training is like my Bible, and I reference that every time I have a conservation bank that I'm looking at with Charlotte. There's also some other sites for information. There's a Fish and Wildlife Service national website. And then there is the Regulatory in Lieu Fee and Bank Information Tracking System, and yes, it is pronounced RIBITS. And that's a database that has a lot of conservation banks across the United States in there. All of the approved banks in Texas are in there, along with all the associated instruments, such as conservation easement, management plans. So that's a really good resource of information to go look up and see how these instruments are developed in Texas, because they are different from the way they've been done in other states to a certain extent. And there's also step-by-step instructions on how to use RIBITS on Austin Ecological Services Conservation Bank page. So, because it is a little difficult the first time you use it to figure out how to maneuver through it. So here's our contact information, and that's the end of my presentation. And Charlotte will be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Charlotte and Kathy. That was great. Good introduction. So we'll save questions for the end of the session. We'll have a couple brief talks by Jesse McLean and Alan McReynolds. We'll also have a panel of questions. So we've got some questions that we've thought up for the panelists, and you guys will be able to add to those as we go. So a word from Jesse McLean with Bandera Conservation Corridor.
How can we use conservation banking as a tool to leverage strategic conservation actions? And so my employer, who is Michael Lewigs, has a storied history in Texas with conservation. And he took the idea of conservation banking, looked at it, kind of tossed it around, and really expanded upon it. The minimum for warblers, our bank is initially focused on warbler mitigation. And that is just the species that has the most compliance associated with it. And so the minimum standard is to set up a 500-acre contiguous preserve. Now, there's a lot of parcels in Texas that meet that criteria. If they have 500 acres, they have available habitat. The warbler occurs within a 35-county band. Kind of it parallels I-35 to the west, and within that, there's probably 4 million acres of available potential habitat. So there's no lack of habitat at the moment, and there's no lack of opportunity to go find a landowner that could set up a conservation bank for the species. So what we did is we kind of looked around the range and identified those areas that were, most strategic to enact conservation in, and we settled on the canyon lands in Bandera County. And our bookends are the about 2,000 acre Lost Maple State Natural Area to the west, and the 2,000 plus acres of the Nature Conservancy's Love Creek Preserve in the east. And what we wanted to do is figure out a way that we could connect that corridor. And so we approached a lot of landowners in the area that we had prior existing relationships with, and then built new relationships from those, and presented our idea and said, what we're trying to do is create a goal of linking adjacent properties and conserving those in perpetuity in an ever-fragmenting landscape. So where this is located is about an hour west of San Antonio, and is likely to be taken down by little ranchettes in the next real estate cycle. Right now, it's unfragmented, high-quality habitat, so it's worthy of conservation efforts. TNC has been in the area. TLC has been in the area. EDF has been in the area for years trying to get conservation to happen on the ground. And fortunately, this tool allowed 2,100 acres to go in our easement last year with 4 easements. And then there's, if you look at the graphic, there's another 6,000 acres that we have kind of staged at various levels through the review process. But there's also a colleague of ours, another bank that's right next door. And so when they come online, that's just adding to the conservation mosaic between those 2 properties, Lost Maple and Love Creek. So what's interesting about our structure is that I'm a banker, I'm not a landowner. I collaborate with landowners, but I essentially purchase easements. I don't own fee title. And so that makes your investment capital go a little bit further. And that's one of the things that is really important to consider about this is all the upfront costs that are associated with the management endowments, the consultants to go through the process, the IRS. The IRS will tax you on creation of credit on the estimated value. So not on the sale. The second you create that, if you create 2,000 credits, then you get taxed on 2,000 credits at the estimated market value at that time. And you may only sell 300 that year. So that's an important consideration when you're working with landowners to deploy this tool, is what are the upfront costs associated with this. The backside of that is what's the driver? How am I going to recoup that cost? And the number one driver is compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And for the most part, the folks that are out there doing that now are large utility companies that have linear corridors cutting through the habitat, or publicly traded companies that have a PR concern. And so it's in their best interest to comply with all the laws. Developers, there's been a lot of activity around San Antonio in past 4 or 5 years regarding development encroaching toward the northwest, toward burning, and impacts the golden cheek warbler habitat. The development community has kind of taken on, if my catchphrase is "catch me if you can." They don't really walk in the front door at the service and try to go consult with them. They challenge the enforcement of the ESA, and most of the times they can get away without compliance. But they have a huge effect on fragmenting the landscape. And so, that's another consideration, is where is your market? And so Charlotte said that there's 4 banks that have been approved since 2010. And what I'd like to say is that the driver of that was the CREZ utility constructions. That was in the range of 4,000 acres or something like that need to be mitigated. And so last year there was $27 million worth of conservation credits sold in Texas. So that's robust, but that's a one-time event. And that had at least a 5-year planning horizon. There are no large linear efforts on the horizon right now. So if you're considering getting in banking at this moment, you should be a well-heeled individual and patient with your money.
Thank you, Jesse. A couple quick questions for Jesse about maybe walk people through the legend of your map, since the print's a little bit small at this scale, and also talk a little bit about your business model. In other words, you talked about the fact that you don't own fee title to the land, and instead you're a banker or a sponsor, and maybe contrast that to a situation where you hold fee title and actually I think you're saying that you don't manage the bank. What are your obligations long-term to those conservation banks?
Those are all very good questions. So going over my map, the areas in kind of the darker green are the easements that we have in place currently. And then the areas in the darker brown are easements that we have staged. And we've either gone through the review process with Charlotte, or we are currently going through the review process on those properties. And what that represents is about 2,400 acres of vireo habitat and an additional 3,000 to 4,000 acres of warbler habitat. So there's no lack of credit availability or habitat to go take down. It's a lack of a market. The lighter brown kind of on that map is private and public conservation efforts that are on the ground right now. And so that's the map. But so Frank asked the question about, the contrasting my role as a banker who does not own fee title to that of a rancher, that is looking at ways to conserve the family ranch or monetize what we call a stranded asset. As agricultural activities decline and more reliance is on hunting, on those hunting leases, properties are getting fragmented to go pay the annual ad valorem taxes and keep up with managing the property. So of the 4 or 5 banks that are approved right now, there's different management and different ownership in all of them. I partner with private landowners that have a conservation interest. They have a long-range estate planning interest, and they see an opportunity to actually realize market value and be compensated for the sale of their easement. Hickory Pass, for example, is a family ranch that came into dire times and found conservation banking is a way to get out of that and protect their land. I've also worked on Clearwater Ranch Conservation Bank, which is a 21,000 acre property on the northeast side of Lake Buchanan in Burnett County. That property was initially conceptualized for residential development over a 50-year horizon. The way they got kind of spun toward conservation banking is the first 1,500 acres they were looking at developing were the most high quality habitat on the property. And luckily for them, they were big enough that they could self-mitigate. But why go through that process and expense if you can also set up a bank with a little bit more effort? Hickory Pass experienced wild success in the 5 years following establishment. And that was primarily due to the regional habitat conservation plan associated in Williamson County. They sold at least 1,000 credits to them. And then other transactions from developers around Williamson County and Travis County through individual Section 10 authorizations have purchased credits as well. In Kendall County, there's Majestic Arts Ranch, which is held by a private foundation, a NGO. And so they had different, a different bend of why they want to conserve their property. However, they're in a highly valued real estate market. And so the going rate generally in Texas for a golden cheek warbler credit, at least near San Antonio, is about $5,000. So it's hard to compel property that's worth $15,000, $20,000 an acre to go take it down, put an easement on it for $5,000 an acre. So Majestic Arts was recently for sale. I don't know if they have been bought or not. I do know that the sign came down off Highway 16 recently. But they also, their banking instrument is interesting in the fact that they could hold their own easement and they could do their own management. And so management is another question that Frank asked. I'm a manager right now of my habitat, and that's a partnership and an agreement that I have with the landowner. So I have dedicated access to access the easement area and conduct management activities on that property per our management plan and per the terms and conditions of the easement. And TNC is our easement holder. So I've taken up a lot of time here, and I'll pass it off to other folks to comment.
Okay, so next up is Alan McReynolds. So I'll see. Alan, do you have a slide or anything? No. Okay, I'll just leave this map up then. Thank you, Alan.
Good morning. I wanted to start off by talking about one of the things that Charlotte mentioned in her slides, which is that conservation banking really began in 1992. In 1993, when I was asked to join the Clinton administration, the reason I was hired was because there were 1,600 development permits that were pending in San Diego County, San Bernardino County, and Orange County that were being held by the biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because they didn't know what to do with them, because there was not habitat or a conservation plan or a multi-species development concept to manage allowing those developers to move forward with their grading permits. So we took on the task of trying to figure out quickly how we could take large tracts of land, ranches and such, and convert them into a National Wildlife Refuge system through mitigation banking. So we did that, and within 5 years we had conserved 40,000 acres and released those 1,600 grading permits, and in the process utilized the Clean Water Act outline to sort of create conservation banking in Southern California, because there was no other template. While we were doing that, we created the opportunity to do stacking or multi-species conservation banking, so that there might be bird credits and vernal pool credits and scrub habitat credits all on the same site, which would allow us to sell all three of those different types of credits, which were very unique, on the same property. We're still having discussions with the Texas field offices about our ability to do that on some of the properties here that we'd like to develop, and in the state of Florida and some of the other states that we're working in. So one of the things that I wanted to mention this morning are some of the concerns that I have about consistency of the application of the ESA between the field offices and the regional offices, because there is not a consistency right now in terms of the way in which the Act is being applied. And for a banker who is trying to look for predictability, which the Act was created to do and the banking system was created to do for developers, we'd like to be able to allow the bankers to have predictability when they enter into a service office and say, we would like to work with you as a collaborator to protect endangered species in this region of the state, and we're focused on these species, and know that we're going to get the same answer that we get in California or in Florida or in Hawaii. And right now, we're struggling with how to do that. One of the things that each site requires is a presence-absence survey. Last year, when we were doing presence-absence surveys for the golden cheek warbler, we encountered a very unique situation. There are only 3 months, more or less, in the year in which you're able to do that in the spring, March, April, early May. Because of the Texas drought and the fact that it was so severe and had lasted for so long, what we found is that the birds had already migrated out of the area that we thought they were occupying, and we were unable to prove that they were there. So we have to wait another year to survey again, which we're going to do, to show that our habitat is indeed occupied, because we think that we have appropriate habitat that we've identified. So if you're intending to get into this business, pay attention to the effects of climate change or the effects of our current drought in Texas on the habitat. Survey early. Make sure that you are working with the service to make sure that you're hiring professionals who have the credentials that the service requires for those present-absent surveys, and engage the service. Charlotte is an incredible collaborator to work with, and she will do whatever she can, I'm sure, to make it a process that's useful and helpful for all of you. The other thing that I would mention is that we have had, over the past 6 to 8 years, a number of hurricanes that affected the Texas coast, and we have found that it is changing and modifying our habitat. And so that's another issue that we hope that the service will take a look at, because it is, like climate change, causing us to take a look at the way in which the landscape is changing and the way in which the habitat, which we thought might recover in 2 to 3 years, is not recovering quite so quickly. And we're concerned about the service making sure that they have adequate protocols and are giving some thought to how they can work with bankers and developers to do that. One of the comments that my colleague here to the right just mentioned is there are no large linear projects on the horizon, and I would beg to differ with that. There are, in fact, highways and pipelines that have been announced that are going to be crisscrossing the state of Texas in the next several years. However, the state and federal agencies view the temporary versus the permanent impacts in a very different way than I do as a conservationist and as a member of the Wildlife and Endangered Species Committee of the Sierra Club, which I sit on. I see any pipeline development, which is a 150-foot wide corridor that's coming through, let's say, 26 counties, grinding up habitat, and they come back and they plant grass over the pipeline so that they can have access to the pipeline in case there's a break or they need repair, as permanent modification to the habitat. Yet many of these pipelines are not being required to purchase credits for every single acre in that 400-mile route that they have cut of the 150-foot swath, because they are saying, oh gee, we've replaced the habitat. Well, indeed they have not. They've planted grass. That's not replacing the habitat. And they are in fact mowing the grass, which is a requirement so they can be able to have access to their pipeline. So while I don't want to be a contrarian this morning, I'd like to suggest to you that there are indeed some things that need to be tweaked in terms of reviewing some of these major pipeline projects and linear projects, overhead power lines, for example, because that is permanent modification to the habitat, not temporary. The surveying results that I've talked about, which are affected by climate change, is really important. If, in fact, we are in a major drought, the golden cheek warbler and the black-cap vireo may, in fact, not be occupying the acreage that they had occupied 5 years ago, because the landscape specifically that you're looking at is much drier, or the trees that they are utilizing for their nesting have died and are not providing the forage that they had utilized. So we need to take a look at where, in fact, the birds might be migrating. So these 35 counties that have been designated, for example, for the golden cheek warbler, those 35 counties which were designated in, 2002, may in fact no longer, all of them may no longer be occupied. So we need to be constantly looking at if, in fact, the birds are still occupying those counties and modifying the map annually rather than every 5 or 10 years, because I think that this severe drought that we're in has changed the landscape of Texas significantly and will continue to do so over the next several years. One of the other issues that has been a concern for me in the past couple of years is the training that is being made available for conservationists, bankers, and others who wish to get into the conservation banking business. The Conservation Fund, which I'm highly keen on receives grants for the training. And if you've been to their training center that they utilize in West Virginia, it's one of the most cutting-edge centers in the United States. However, most of the slots that are made available for their training are only available for agency staff. It's pretty difficult to get in unless you're a member of a state or federal agency that's working on that. So I would suggest to my colleagues here with the state and federal agency this morning that they encourage the Conservation Fund to take a look at making at least 50% of their slots available to us so that we can learn how to do this, so that we can become collaborators and have a much more collegial relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I hope I didn't cut you off
No,
there.
I'm done.
I'd like to be sure we have a chance to hear from the land trust representatives here, and of course there's a million things we could talk about. A session like this could easily go on for several hours, and I know I'd be interested the whole time. So Dan and Mark, I'd like to ask you guys a little bit more about the land trust role in conservation banking. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the obligations that are created, what it's like. We don't have to answer all these questions, but some ideas. What is it like negotiating these agreements? What role do you play in negotiating the banking agreement, if any? And what role do you play in negotiating the conservation easement, if any? And then what obligations are created for you from these conservation banks?
Well, I'll speak for the Nature Conservancy, and some of our experiences. Initially working with Jesse and the guys over at the Bandera Conservation Bank, and that was an area in Texas that we were, highly interested in. We have our Love Creek Preserve, which is a little over 2,000 acres, and we've been working in that area for quite some time, and know most of the landowners around there, and know that those landowners were interested in conservation, but the typical tools that we use were not necessarily interested in. However, they were interested in conservation. So when this opportunity came up with this bank, that was certainly of interest to us because it kind of bookended a lot of that property in between Lost Maples State Park and our Love Creek Preserve. So we were certainly interested in that area, and we started working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Jesse and Mike and his partners over at Bandera. And we came in, particularly when the conservation easement negotiations started, and had some influence in that, and some input on that, some input on the management of the bank, of the actual habitat, not the bank itself, but we're able to have some influence on that. And I would say from a land trust standpoint, I think it's important that we get in early in these negotiations, be it particularly with the conservation easement. If we're going to hold the conservation easement, get in very early in those negotiations, because we're going to be the ones left holding that and managing that in perpetuity. And then as far as the management of the actual land goes, there could be the option that we may also serve as the manager on the land. So any kind of influence we can have in that, if that is your interest, I think is important. We're looking at these banks, particularly in areas of high priority conservation that we may already be interested in. This Bandera area is an area that we were interested in, so it made perfect sense. There's other areas of Texas that we're interested in that we may not have a stronghold in conservation yet, but banks like this might be another opportunity for the Nature Conservancy. Anytime we can have connectivity to existing projects or conservation areas and corridors for wildlife in this area, golden cheek warblers, we're very interested in. So there's a million things that can be done with this, and I think it's a very good tool, and one that I think is continually being refined. And I think as we progress with more of these conservation banks, that we'll all continue to learn. Those of us in the land trust community, Fish and Wildlife Service continues to modify their thinking, and as do the conservation banks. But I think Kathy hit on it early. Is communication is, I think, key from the get-go for all parties and, of course, I'm with the land trust, so I think particularly from our standpoint, we typically kind of come in toward the tail end of these things, or have in some cases, and we're the ones oftentimes left holding the perpetual responsibility of these things. So if we can get in at the get-go, I think that's very important.
Just to reiterate what Dan said, I'm a big proponent of mitigation banking. I think it provides a really unique conservation tool to kind of commoditize land conservation and get us access to private lands that you would not normally have access to. Texas Land Conservancy started with wetland mitigation banking in 2008. We currently hold 9 wetland mitigation bank easements and 1 conservation bank easement, totaling about 26,000 acres across the state. So we're well versed in what's going on in those realms, and it has really given us an opportunity to expand our conservation portfolio. The takeaways are, this is the playbook that you have for donated conservation easements working with private landowners is out the window. This is not based on altruism. It's not based on a conservation ethic. At its core, it's based on a business opportunity, and that's what the land trusts need to be aware of. And so the takeaway from that is you have to really think about the triangle between agency, mitigation banker, and land trust, and making sure those 3 things are all in parity together. So that's been the real learning curve for us. A few things. Kathy mentioned the handbook that is done with Eli, Environmental Law Institute, which we are part of. It's a really valuable tool. It's based on wetlands, but it's got some real good parallels for all conservation banking. It should be available online through Land Trust Alliance, I believe. Along with Alan's comment, Land Trust Alliance has caught on to this and is thinking. They've actually developed some criteria, standards, and practices for mitigation banking, especially for land trusts that are trying to stay in compliance with standards and practices and accreditation, because those things don't necessarily go hand in hand with what banks are needing to be done. And so everybody's trying to get to the same page. It's such a short time horizon we've been working on, but it's getting there slowly but surely. The big thing in my mind is that when you're working on a donated easement, you're trying to create a case for why this is such a valuable piece of property to protect. You're developing a whole host of conservation values. You're trying to get to the highest echelon to prove to the IRS like this is a worthy donation. In a mitigation bank, you're trying to get to a threshold to check the box. And that's not meant as a ding. It's like, hey, we've got this done, we've got this done, we've got this done. And so it's not always the same thing. From a land trust, we're coming at that we need to create this case for why we're working on this. The mitigation banker's thinking, I need to get this thing through the permitting process and move on down the road. And so it's really important in my mind for everybody to understand what you're in it for, and to make sure that it's meeting your mission, your goals, and why you're getting involved with this. And there's no hard feelings at the end of this thing. I have great relationships with our mitigation banking partners. Some of them work with us almost in the same way that we would consider working with our landowners. They're working with the private landowner themselves. Others are just a business opportunity. They're nice folks, but they're in it to make a buck. They're getting on down the road, and they're doing what their due diligence requires them to do. So it's just to be aware of what is being asked of you at that point in time. So those are my basic thoughts, and we can answer any questions on that.
Thank you, Mark and Dan. That's great. It's very helpful. I do have a question for Kathy and Charlotte about conservation easement, the form of the conservation easement. I think you said that there's a template's being worked out for the conservation banking agreement. Is there a template for the conservation easement? And if not, what role can the land trust play, if any, in helping with the creation of that template? And if we're not involved early, at what point do the agencies feel that we should be involved in that process?
That's a great question, and there is not right now a template for conservation easement being developed by the service. And one of the reasons is that the service doesn't actually sign the easement. And so when we were going through discussions about what we should work on templates for, the bank agreement being the biggest one, because the service signs it with their authority and approval under ESA, the credits are generated. So The other issue, of course, is that the Southwest region has 4 states, and each state would have a slightly different set of rules and regulations with regard to conservation easements. So right now, the service's position is that we will work with the banker and the landowner and the land trust to make sure that the protections for the species that we need to see in the conservation easement are there, but we do not have a format that we require. In terms of getting involved, we've said it several times up here already, get involved as early as you can. I think some of the things that I've learned from talking to land trusts is you're not always invited to be at the table. You may hear about it late in the game. Somebody may come to you and say, oh, the service is going to require a permanent conservation easement. I'd like for you to take a look at this piece of property and tell me whether or not you're willing to do that. Kathy and I are always available. Please pick up the phone and call us. Or ask your banker who the point of contact at the agency is and who you should be speaking to. I would not feel, if I were a land trust, that you cannot contact the agency. We are always willing and able to talk to you. We are happy to provide you with information and guidance. If we do not have the answers, we have a national banking coordinator in DC who's very helpful and has worked in California for a long time. I'm sure Alan is familiar with her, and we can get those answers for you. So the amount of information and knowledge on conservation banks is growing across the country. There's a growing interest in it. There's a growing interest in the land trust community. There's a growing interest in bankers. So we are willing to work with you and help you in whatever way we can. But please do contact us if you have questions.
Piggyback on that real quick. While there is not a standard template and it's good they're working towards that, one thing you can expect is that these are in all cases highly restrictive easements. They're not what you would normally anticipate for a donated ranch easement where you've got reserved building envelopes and the right to graze animals and to do things. They're designed to protect the resources, like Charlotte said, even this is wetland side or it's conservation side. And so you're either getting into no subdivision or highly limited subdivision rights and very, very restrictive easements. So there's not many reserved rights that are retained on these easements that you normally would be anticipating looking at.
If I could add one more comment with regard to that. On the project that Charlotte and I were looking at last spring, there was a conservation easement already on the ranch, and it was not restrictive enough to satisfy the agencies. And so my attorney put together a compare and contrast matrices showing the land trust easement against, and we didn't have one from the service, but we had one from the Corps of Engineers, showing their standard template easement agreement and showing where there was a deficiency, which mirrors what he just said, because the ranch was allowed to continue to graze cattle, to allow development of buildings and roads throughout the ranch, which was totally inconsistent with the conservation plan that we had designed for the species. So I would encourage the service to take a look at developing just a sample that they make available to people of what a conservation easement could be, and saying you don't have to use this but, because I think that it would be very helpful for the land trust to be able to have something that could include and incorporate this sort of thing when you're looking at a conservation bank.
Thank you, Alan. We'll take questions from the audience now.
Hi, thank you. I have two questions. One is it possible to get the Army Corps easement that you're mentioning to use as kind of a model so we have some sense of what we're talking about before we really think about getting into this? And also, is there any funding available for stewardship to the land trusts to manage and monitor these easements in perpetuity?
I can actually answer both of those since I've done that. But yes, first of all, in Texas you have the Tulsa District, which has the area along the Red River, the Fort Worth District, which has the majority of the state, and then the Galveston District, which has along the coast. Each of those three Army Corps districts have standard conservation easements on their website, and without saying affirmatively for them, since they're not here to speak for themselves, I can tell you that they are very closely similar, and I would encourage the land trust to start with that rather than perhaps your own conservation easement that you've been utilizing, because these generally are much more restrictive. And if I may just offer one example, I had a tract of land that we were developing, and we had planted all the trees. We're not talking about conservation banking, we're talking about a wetland bank. And the grandson invited all of his college fraternity brothers to come and get on four-wheelers one weekend and drove through all of our trees and created new trails across our wetland. And I said, who's responsible for this at this point? I have to replace the trees, but you know, how did this happen? How did you allow people to get out here on this property? Who wasn't paying attention? The landowner, me, the conservation easement holder, who? You know, who's responsible? But the point is that everyone is in the game together. We're all in this together. Now, your other question had to do with creating an endowment for long-term management. That should be negotiated up front. You should ask for a specified amount based upon the size of the tract and the obligation. Because for the first 10 years, the mitigation banker is responsible for managing the habitat or the resource that's being permitted, either with the service or the Corps of Engineers. At the end of 10 years, the banker is formally released from the permit obligations, and the land trust takes over. You must have an endowment that you have negotiated up front, whether it's sold, accumulated from the sale as you sell each credit, or one lump sum that's written and donated to the land trust, so that you have the capability to manage the land afterwards.
So Alan, I think you're referring to a management endowment. Is that what we would call that?
Right.
So, and in addition, you'll want to, you know, request a stewardship endowment from the landowner or the banker, and you know, you really need to be very cautious about what your long-term obligations are going to be. That should be one of the takeaways today for the land trust community. Jesse, did you have a quick word on that?
Yeah, so I'd like to make a distinction. Much of what Alan just described comes out of the wetland side, and it's promulgated by federal policy and rules. That it goes back to what's called the 2008 rule for wetland banking. Conservation banking doesn't have that rule yet. There is no written policy that says conservation banks are the preferred solution for mitigation. Right. Also, as opposed to wetlands, preservation of existing habitat is the primary focus of conservation banks, whereas in wetlands, uplift and improvement of the mitigation site is important. And that's why the first 10 years in a mitigation bank is crucial, that the banker is on site doing management, and the performance of that mitigation is occurring. Whereas conservation banking, we're just kind of maintaining, or you know, or trying to enhance the habitat, but you're not required to. However, there could be a banking instrument that's created that recognizes restoration or creation of habitat.
Yeah, I will say that is species specific. Mm-hmm. So what Jesse's talking about is golden cheek warblers, black-cap vireos, for example, would require considerably more management actions.
I think Dan wants to chime in real quickly, and then we'll take another question from the audience.
Just make a quick comment regarding, you know, any kind of easement template that the service or any of the other federal agencies that you may work with. You know, I would just encourage you as a land trust to take what you've learned and the experience that you've gained. You know, some land trusts have been doing it for 50, 60 years and have a lot of experience with conservation easements, where some of these agencies certainly have some experience with conservation easements, but I would urge you to, you know, be part of those negotiations, and they can be negotiated. And as land trust holding the easement, you should be in those. And so I would just, not to be contrary, I just think it should be guarded with templates.
While we're here, we're talking through it. It's good. Sir?
Yes, an administrative question. Will the presentation materials be available post-conference
Yes, they will. So keep an eye out. Check the website again about a week after the conference, and all those materials should be posted online. Also, we're filming all or at least most of the sessions, and we'll also be making those available. Sir?
Yeah, my question really has to do with, you know, sort of the perpetuity and the long-range management of the endowment. I'm a layperson with this. I'm not a land trust professional, but I work actively with the service and the Balcones Canyonlands area, and the boundary and the template out there is a patchwork of protected lands versus not protected lands within the refuge boundary. And so I guess my question is just, you know, short of having the funding available to buy all that land at fee title, which is what that was created, that was what we had in mind when we created it. What are the vehicles for the avenues for leveraging the service obligations to manage that boundary versus, say, an individual land trust holding an easement and applying its, the land trust professional skills and expertise to put easements in place, land banking, whatever. It just seems like the obvious that, well, that's the hardest part from the land trust perspective, is that perpetual protection and management of land. But that's the federal government's obligation under their charter with the Department of Interior. So, where do those cross and how do those relate? I guess is kind of my question.
Good. So I also hear you sort of highlighting the discrepancies between different programs that exist for habitat conservation, and it gets really complicated, and there's a lot of terminology that I'm still mixed up on. So this is a...
Yeah, and I mean, just, and regardless of the specific land management for the species, the service, their fire management plan, which is a big part of that management, they do that somewhat informally with landowners that are under no form of agreement at all, really. It's just well, we're going to do fire control here to manage our land, and we'll just, do the same for you across the fence. We'll just figure out how to put the fence back later when the posts burn. But, that kind of goes on now. So I just, it seems like that's the opportunity, because that's the tough nut to crack for the land trust side.
So I see Charlotte leaning forward and eager to answer.
So I should
maybe
probably take this one.
I think he was referring to the Balcones Canyonlands Refuge.
Yes.
And maybe contrast that and address some of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction here is that this is mitigation. Okay, so let's be clear. It's not. There's a regulatory tie to every acre that is credited. It is assigned to offset an impact that is permitted under the Endangered Species Act elsewhere. And so that obligation to complete that mitigation resides with the permittee, essentially. The banker in this scenario is taking on that obligation through their transaction. So they're coming as a provider of mitigation and offering to sell those credits to offset the permittee's action, whatever that take was to whichever species. And so that with that requirement, from the services perspective, comes the need to manage that in perpetuity to protect the species, because what was on the landscape within the impacted site is gone and no longer providing those functions and values. So from that perspective, I think it's a little bit different from a refuge acquisition boundary and looking at building the federal lands now. Balcones, for example, certainly has both golden cheek warbler and black-cap vireo habitat, and so it also provides some of those functions and values. But the federal government's not going to take on the mitigation obligation for the permittee. It's their impact under the Endangered Species Act, and therefore they have to mitigate it, and this is one way that it can be mitigated.
That's good. Thank you, Charlotte. Another question? In the back of the room, sir.
Yeah, it pertains to the credits and the debits. Just in curiosity, how the value is established, and is it really a free market beyond the establishment of a supply and demand free market?
Does anybody want to grab that one?
Well, it's market driven.
So the debit amount comes through the permitting process, so it'll either come through a Section 7 or a Section 10 in terms of what the impacts are and what would need to be replaced. And then the credits are evaluated by the service along with the assistance of Parks and Wildlife in terms of what that acreage is providing back to the species. For the bird species, right now the crediting process we have is an acre of occupied habitat for the species that can be managed in perpetuity is provided one credit. And then if there are other in-holdings or buffer areas, we can evaluate those as long as they're put under the easement at half credit per acre.
We had a question right over here. That's quite all right.
So at a couple of different places in this process, I can see where separate mineral interest might be a consideration. Does the Fish and Wildlife Service consider severed mineral interest before approval of a bank site? And then for the land trust that are going to be holding the conservation easement, I know how controversial severed mineral interest is with donated easements. How does it affect the conservation easements for these habitat conservation banks?
Yes. She can't see you.
Yes, can't even see me. I feel like I should stand up. Again, that's a great question, and if I wasn't in this session, I'd be in the other session on oil and gas. It's something that we struggle with. The answer is yes, we do require a title report, and we do want to know what those severed interests are, as well as any other easements that go across the parcel. If we find something that we think is problematic, or where we do not believe the protection, that other easement or interest is going to supersede the conservation interest, then we will go back to the banker, the landowner, the prospective easement holder, our solicitor in our regional office, and have those discussions. And we have had cases where there was another type of interest on the property that we felt superseded the conservation interest, and we have ultimately turned down or had some very serious conversations about how we would work through those. But yes, it's a problem not only here, but in any of the states in the Southwest region. We are working through those issues as best we can. Thankfully, we have the tool of the Endangered Species Act to help us a little bit, in that some of those actions might ultimately require a permit through the service, and so there might be a way for us to work through that on the permitting side as well.
If I could offer that we also, in the process of developing the permit application through the banking side, we will designate on the property proposed pad sites and linear easements for the natural gas pipelines, so they can pipe the gas off the property. Right. Now, does that mean that the oil companies have to utilize those sites? No. But we file this map with the service, and we say we are anticipating that this property is going to be developed, assuming that it has not already been developed, but it's perhaps been leased. Then we say to the oil company, when they want to come onto the property and start building a pad site or dredging for a pipeline easement, wait a minute, work with us. This is a protected site. Work with us and the service. Take a look first at the pad sites that we have indicated on the property, which are outside of the best habitat within the boundary of the preserve that we're creating here. And generally, they will do that. Sometimes they are resistant. But be proactive. Create these sites on your map and file it with the service and say, we anticipate that this property is going to be developed and we can't prevent it. However, we are here to protect the species. That is our job, and we are never going to step back from that role, and we will be on the oil companies all of the time to make sure that that gate is locked and that only they are coming onto the property and that the habitat is being preserved.
All right, thank you, Alan. Sorry to cut you off there. We're getting approaching the time of our luncheon, and I want to, I think some of our speakers would be willing to stick around and take a few more questions for folks who don't want to rush off. I think that there's a few takeaways that are apparent to me as, if you're a land trust and you're in the room and you're thinking about conservation banks, just try to get to the table as early as possible. Be wary if you're not invited to the table early, and because you're going to need to walk people through a bit of backing up, you might say. And be aware of what the expectations are on both sides. Make it very obvious to the other parties what your expectations and goals are for the project, and make sure that those are aligned. You may have to make some compromises, just as you do with every deal. There's a lot of complex issues that certainly need to be covered as well. Folks who are in here missed the concurrent session on oil and gas and mineral development on conservation easement properties. There's a lot of resources available for that, and you'd certainly want to be advised by an attorney with anything like that. So for those who want to stick around, we'll take a few more questions, maybe for another 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up. Other folks are welcome to leave. Thank you.
I'm curious, for those species that are not listed or candidate species, where is the demand coming from, and how are those funded? So who's gonna pay for those credits, for example, if they don't have to?
So there are actually groups that are interested in whether it's from a PR perspective or whether it's because they see a decision on the horizon. They are willing and looking at conservation plans and candidate conservation agreements with candidate species and other non-listed species.
Are there any that are actually on the ground that are being implemented, that have actually been bought and sold to the credit system?
Not in Texas. There is a voluntary group that is looking at gopher tortoise, I believe, in the eastern part of the range, and they are looking at where it is not listed, and they actually have some credit trading going on, voluntary credit trading and credit distribution for that species. So there are some examples. There aren't any examples here in this state yet, but there may be in the near future. There are several listing decisions that that are being considered in the next 5-year period, and so I think that companies and certainly state governments are starting to look at what can be done in terms of helping those species now, and so that we ultimately can consider that as part of the listing decision. And so getting that conservation on the ground through a conservation bank for a candidate species now would be a very good thing.
Thank you, Charlotte. Other questions? In the back of the room, Steve?
Yeah, I had a question specific to conservation purposes within the easement document. I know the service is single species minded for this program, but in touching on some of the things that Alan mentioned, climate change, species redistribution, all that entails, I'm just curious how you handle the conservation purposes, because as all the people that are involved on the land trust side of the business know, one of the reasons that you can get a conservation easement terminated is that conservation purposes can no longer be met. So is the intent only to preserve the property insofar as it supports that species, and then if that species is no longer using the property, that service is okay with somebody coming in and getting the easement terminated? Or are you guys looking at it more holistically, trying to expand the conservation purposes to meet that eventuality?
That's a great question, and I think Mark touched on that a little bit, but we definitely want to get some more answers to that. I'll reiterate or maybe say it a different way. Land trusts are pretty limited in our resources and time, and sometimes when we've got 5 different deals we're looking at, and one stands some risk of not being perpetual because it's part of the private market and there's no other purpose. It can really make us a bit squeamish. So sometimes, in negotiations, some folks might recommend another conservation value which has more of a potential to be forever protected, for instance, water quality protection. And, how does the service feel about that? And is there a way to support having multiple conservation purposes in a conservation easement?
I think the simple answer is yes. I mean, the service is supportive of having multiple conservation purposes in a conservation easement, as long as none of those, were to contradict the need for mitigation for the species on the property. And obviously, as you said, that's our primary purpose. But I've certainly seen examples from land trusts where there are many conservation purposes listed, and while I can't speak on behalf of my regional office, I don't think that we would kick that back and have those removed necessarily. As it goes to the point of if the species were no longer to persist on the property or were to be delisted, We have had people ask what would happen, and actually, Kathy, you and I spoke about this the other day, so, and you gave a great answer, so you want to speak?
Okay, I'll try. All right, so let's use the black-cap vireo as an example. The decision that the service makes on the status of the species is based on the populations and the areas that are under conservation that support those populations. So if the species is in jeopardy, they're not going to allow as much development or as much take as they would, depending on if it's maybe it's still, you know, endangered, but the populations are coming back. So if the black-cap vireo was delisted tomorrow, all of those areas that are under conservation for black-cap vireo have to remain under conservation, because that's part of the baseline, the population numbers that the service made the decision on to delist. So is that clear to everybody?
So what's the flip side? What if it goes extinct?
You had to make it difficult,
I've
Mark.
been told that is not a forward-thinking question to ask.
Not an option.
That's not in the portfolio of answers. We won't accept that.
I really appreciate Kathy's thoughts there, because we frequently talk about what happens if the species is delisted, and you know, what does that do to that conservation value. You know, if you're protecting habitat, I would presume that you know, it will include possibly some other species as well. You know, you'll need to negotiate that in the terms of the conservation easement, but I'm very glad to hear that if the species is delisted, that protection is still considered a requirement of the service. One more question before we wrap up, and then if anybody has additional questions, you know, feel free to approach the panelists afterwards. RJ?
Quick question, Charlotte. Should be easy. In order for land trusts to be proactive in knowing what kind of conservation banks might be coming up in their area, can you address public notices or other public comment information so we can know what's happening?
Yeah, so unlike the Corps, we don't have that public notice requirement. Usually what happens is we'll have a banker or a private landowner contact us and ask us. I will say that through Lori Olson and some other members of the land trust community, you all have been much more proactive in coming to us and saying, we want to be involved earlier. And so as part of our work going forward, we intend to ask these folks to involve you as early as possible and bring you to the table. We will ask them if they've thought about who their easement holder should be, and at some point we probably won't continue the discussion any further until we have a land trust who's engaged and either has a letter of intent or is interested in being part of those negotiations. You know, we certainly see the value in doing that early rather than getting to the end of the process only to find out that maybe the land trust is not happy with the documentation. Trust me, it's not any fun for me to go back to my regional office and solicitor and say everything that we agreed to we're going to have to revise, not for a bad purpose, but because we want to add some more, you know, protections or purposes or interests, but you know, their time is limited. They have a lot of projects that they look at. So
that's very, very good to hear. You know, a lot of land trusts, we have concerns that we might be the spoiler coming in at a late date with new ideas. So thank you very much for that comment, Charlotte. Thank you guys for sticking around.